The address Doc Takagi had given me led to an old dilapidated warehouse in the industrial district. I couldn't imagine what Lysilsa had hoped to find here, but I drew my weapon and slipped through a hole in the wall as I started my search. The place reeked of mildew and rot, and as I worked my way inward, my senses were on overdrive. Smashed crates and unidentifiable bits of junk littered the cavernous space. If she'd been looking for something to steal, she was far too late. The place had been picked clean long ago. Now it stood empty like a ransacked tomb. The first floor was a bust, so I made my way up the stairs, wincing at every groan and squeak as I crept up to the second floor. Once upon a time there had been a suite of offices here, so I made that my first stop. As I drew nearer, new odors assaulted my nose, ones all too familiar. A sinking feeling settled deep into my gut as I eased the door open with my sidearm, gazing at the forms within. I didn't bother ordering the residents to raise their hands as I holstered my piece. Not only would they not have heard me, they wouldn't have cared. Lysilsa had led me to a sparker den. Sparkers were the ultimate addicts. Eschewing the usual narcotics and stimulants, they sought a high that never ended. Why face the inevitable withdrawal symptoms if you didn't have to? Not when the alternative was so simple and so alluring. All you had to do was insert a wire into your brain to stimulate the pleasure center and turn on the juice. Obviously, you couldn't perform the procedure yourself, but luckily there were plenty of individuals out there that would happily do it for you. It wasn't cheap, of course. The drug trade relied heavily on repeat business to make their credits, and that didn't apply to sparkers. Once the transaction was complete, they wouldn't require their services again. In fact, they wouldn't require anything ever again. Once you turned sparker, there was no turning back. One taste of pure pleasure, and they were hooked for life. Nothing else mattered to a sparker. They would simply lie there and ride the high and forget everything else. Like eating, drinking, everything. A sparker would lie in his own filth until he starved to death, though it rarely took that long for them to die. Dehydration or disease usually carried them away first, and as they lay there, rotting, the sparker next to them wouldn't even notice. A dozen or so bodies lay strewn on the floor around me, each one trailing a cord from their craniums to an electrical socket in the wall. I made my way from one body to the next, and while most were long gone, one or two were still clinging to life, a beatific smile plastered onto their faces. They say it's the most pleasant way to die ever invented, but I've seen too many dens to ever consider it. I don't care how happy they look. It's ugly. I stopped at the second to last body. He'd been dead for a while, days at least, maybe even a couple weeks. At least I knew now why Lysilsa was heading here when she'd met her end, as I looked down at the still form, his feathers matted with decomposition and excrement. "Hello, Colorier," I said. I left the warehouse the same way I'd come in, putting as much distance between myself and the building as I could, while my brain spun like an overclocked gyro. Lysilsa must have been searching for her brother, and somehow, somewhere, she'd gotten a lead. Maybe she'd spotted the movers emptying their apartment, and made herself scarce before she was spotted. Only she had no idea what had happened to Colorier, and started looking for him. They were the only family they had, and she was just a kid. She must have stayed out of sight somewhere, which was simple enough. They don't call it the Warren for nothing. But while she was hunting for her brother, someone was hunting her. 2 siblings, 2 deaths. Some might chalk it up to coincidence, but not me. I've been in this business far too long to believe in it. I was convinced Colorier hadn't voluntarily turned sparker, which made it a homicide. There were no other similarities in their final moments. save one. A sparker is classified as a suicide, which means no investigation. And a dead Hetira barely rates a notice, unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstances, which also means no investigation. Someone wanted this buried deep and made sure no one official would examine it too closely. Except someone did. Me. But what had they done to draw this kind of heat on themselves? They were both as clean as you could hope for in a place like the Warren, and I doubt they'd intentionally stuck their noses into somebody's business. So, what did that leave? The only thing I could think of was they'd seen something they shouldn't have. Wrong place, wrong time. Or maybe one of Lysilsa's customers had whispered something in the throes of passion he shouldn't have, and she told her brother, or whoever killed them, feared she had. The question was, what? I didn't report finding the Sparker den when I returned to the squad room. That would raise far too many questions. Questions I wasn't in the mood to answer. Sooner or later, someone else would stumble onto the bodies and call it in, and that would be the end of it. My hands were clean. Yeah, Q. Keep telling yourself that. Maybe someday you'll even believe it. I got back just in time for Lervo and I to catch a doubleheader. Your basic domestic murder-suicide. Husband found out his wife had been cheating on him and strangled her, then in a fit of remorse threw himself off a building. There were even witnesses. In fact, he'd even confessed to one of them before taking the swan dive. Open and shut, just the way we like it. Once they finished scraping the husband off the pavement and hauled them away, Lervo gave me an appraising look. You finished tying up those loose ends? He asked. Yeah, just routine, I told him. Nothing to worry about. Good to hear, he said. You don't want something biting you in the ass when you least suspect it. I froze in my tracks. Lervo stopped as well, and as we looked at each other, it was as if an invisible wall had appeared between us. That was no idle comment from a partner. It was a warning. It's done, I told him, lying through my teeth. Can't let yourself get caught up in the cases. It'll just make you crazy. I even managed a half smile. Or worse, he agreed, as we started walking again. Lervo and I had been partners for a long time. We'd been through it all together, and in all that time I'd never had reason not to trust him. He'd saved my life more times than I could count, just as I had his. We weren't friends exactly, but I'd always trusted him. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure. The rest of the day seemed to drag on like wading through the yeast vats. Lervo and I chatted about one thing or another as we dealt with the inevitable paperwork, but I was never so thankful in my life to clock out at the end of our shift. I needed to get away, needed time to think. I needed time to figure out my next move. Unfortunately, I had other business to attend to. The address Tikaji had given me was in Blue Sector, and I found myself dragging my feet as I headed over to uphold my end of the bargain. She only wanted me to give him a warning, I told myself. A couple slaps at worst. Better to get it done and move on for all concerned than to drag it out. I jammed my hands into my pockets and hunched my shoulders as I forced myself to pick up the pace, arriving at a quiet little apartment in one of the nicer sections of town. I knocked on the door, and a few moments later, a droop-eared Cheltel cautiously peered out. Yes? He asked nervously. Kabashif Dafour? I asked him. His reaction was immediate. He yelped and tried to slam the door in my face. Of course I'd been expecting that. Now I know what you're thinking, that I'd wedged my foot into the open space to prevent him from doing just that. But that's a rookie mistake. You could just as easily end up with a broken foot that way. So what you do instead is place your foot against the door, away from the jam, and lean into it. That way, when the person you want to chat with tries to shut you out, the door just bounces off, which is exactly what happened. "Guess you've been expecting me," I growled as I grabbed him by his shirt and slammed him into the wall. Dapper squealed in terror as I backhanded him, whimpering as I brought it back for a hard slap on the other side of his face. "Doc Takagi sends her regards and wants to know when you'll be settling your account," I snarled, putting all my acting skills into it. What most folks don't realize is that it's not the pain that gets their attention, it's the anticipation. No matter what you're planning, what they're imagining inside their head is 1,000 times worse. You give them a chance to visualize that, to let them make it immediate and real in their own mind, and suddenly they're falling all over themselves to give you what you want. "I just need a couple days," he pleaded. "Honest, I'll have the credits for her before the end of the week." I debated flashing the badge, and decided against it. It would really be just gilding the lily at this point, and truth be told, I always felt uncomfortable using my position like that. I may not be a saint, but I do have standards. Most of the time, anyway. Sometimes you have to be flexible about those, if you're living in the Warren. 2 days, I nodded slowly as I leaned into him. And not an hour more, unless you want me to come back. "I swear I'll have her credits," he howled. "Good," I smiled as I released him. Dapper cowered as I loomed over him. "'Cause otherwise, I'd have to do this," I told him as I punched him in the abdomen. He folded like a cheap suit, gasping for air. "Let me give you a little advice. Never bet with credits you don't have," I told him as I walked out the door. He wouldn't listen, of course. They never do. Gamblers are always so sure that the next bet will be the big score, despite all the evidence to the contrary. They never learn. Maybe none of us do, when you come right down to it. I headed for my favorite watering hole and told the bartender to leave the bottle. I wasn't just washing away the slime I always felt after a muscle job. It was the case that was forefront in my mind, and what my next move would be. After Lervo's veiled threat, I'd have to step even more lightly than before, even though I desperately wanted to ask him where that was coming from. I couldn't, of course, and he wouldn't tell me, which meant I was alone. I needed more information, and I could only think of one place to find it. It was time to pay Madame Midnight a visit. I had to be more cautious now, which meant I couldn't afford to disappear during my shifts anymore, not after Lervo's warning. The day seemed to crawl along like a Kengshu serpent, but finally, I was able to punch out and pick up my investigation where I'd left off. If Lysilsa really had been a Hetara, then there was only one person who could give me more information about her, and that was Madame Midnight. She'd started as a Hetara herself, years ago, and had worked her way up the ladder until she now ran the most well-known bordello in the Warren. Whatever your interest, she was more than happy to cater to it. For a price, of course. I made a stop by my place first, and made a sizable dent in my weekly water ration to clean up, before putting on one of my better suits. Madame Midnight's place was uptown, under the dome, and even with the badge, I'd have a hard time making it past the bouncers if I looked like a derelict. It was a little early for the real party to get started, which suited me just fine. The fewer people that saw me at her place, the better I liked it. As it turned out, I didn't need the badge. Both the bouncers recognized me and waved me through without so much as a pause. One of her girls met me at the door and took me by the arm as she guided me inside. "Detective Mukherjee, this is an unexpected pleasure," she purred, pressing up against me. I didn't recognize her, but she obviously recognized me. It made sense that the ladies would know who the cops were by sight. They were probably under orders to give me the VIP treatment, if I was so inclined. "My name is Duzana, How may we serve you this evening? There wasn't a hint of subtlety in that offer, but then if you were looking for subtle, Madame Midnight's establishment was the last place you'd find it. She was vaguely humanoid, but the horns and skin ridges I found off-putting, even if it had been a while. I need a private chat with your boss, I told her. Tell her it's important. I see, she smiled. The madam is with a rather influential client at the moment, but if you would wait at the bar, I'll be happy to let her know you're here. She was already guiding me in that direction, and it seemed the easier choice to let her do it. Besides, I've never said no to a drink in my life. One of my more glaring weaknesses, I'm afraid. That'll be fine, I said, as she found me an empty spot at the end of the bar. She even knew not to put my back to the door, which I appreciated. I pulled out my credit rod and gave her a nice little tip, not only in gratitude for the gesture, but to help speed things along. It's how the universe works, Duzana smiled in acknowledgement. Please give the detective whatever he wants, she told the bartender, before gracing me with a bow. It shouldn't be very long, she said, letting her hand linger for a moment on my shoulder before departing. Damn. Maybe Lervo was right. Whiskey neat? I told the bartender. After that moment, I needed a distraction. I sipped my drink as I looked around the room at the clientele. I recognized a couple of people, though they were doing their level best to avoid my gaze. Something about a cop in a whorehouse makes folks uncomfortable, for some reason. I don't see why. It's not like we went out of our way to raid a place like Madame Midnight's. She was smart enough to keep her payments to the Widows and Orphans Fund up to date at all times. Simpler for everybody that way. I was on my second drink when Duzana returned. The madam will be happy to see you now, she told me, taking my arm once more. Once again, I let her guide me. I wasn't here to make waves, and Madame Midnight was the kind of woman who appreciated courtesy. In fact, I guess you could say it was her bread and butter. She led me back to the private section of the building, opening the door to an ornately furnished office. Madame Midnight rose from her chair and extended a hand, while Duzana made a discreet exit. Detective, it's been far too long, she trilled, as I took her hand and kissed it gently. Likewise, I said, as we both sat down. Whatever else you can say about her, the lady had class. So, I understand you're here on a matter of some urgency? She prompted. Nothing too serious, I hope. Not for you, at least, I replied. I was hoping you could help me with something I've been working on. Oh, and what might that be? She asked, leaning back in her chair. I fished Lysilsa's picture from her file out of my pocket and handed it over. I was hoping you might be able to tell me something about her, I explained. Name is Lysilsa Ethrion. I'm fairly certain she wasn't independent, but I know you keep tabs on pretty much everyone in the business. I do my best to stay current, she acknowledged, as she gazed at the image. It was always a little disconcerting talking to her. With 5 eyes arranged in a semicircle across her forehead, I was never quite sure where to focus on. You said was, she continued. Can I take that to mean she is no longer with us? I'm afraid so, I confirmed. We found her body 2 days ago in Green Sector. Her throat was cut. Such a tragedy, she sighed, shaking her head. It always grieves me when a working girl is harmed, whether she's in my employ or not, especially with the low priority their deaths are given by the department, she said pointedly, giving me a not-so-subtle verbal jab. I don't disagree, but you know how it is. I shrugged. That's part of the reason I'm working this case myself, off the books. And the other reason? She asked, as she picked up her glass and sipped. I still didn't have a good answer for that, Just something about it, I mumbled. She regarded me for a moment before handing back the picture. I'm afraid I don't know her, she told me. I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help. I held up my hand. Keep it. Maybe one of your girls will recognize her. I'll be happy to show it around, she said with a smile. It seems a shame you came all the way out here, only to leave empty-handed. I tell you what, there's no need to rush off. Why not stay for a while? I'm certain any of my ladies would love to make your acquaintance. Her eyes twinkled with merriment. On the house, of course. Why was everyone so concerned about my love life? Not unless you've got a human working for you, I said uncomfortably. Her throaty chuckle sent shivers up and down my spine. I'm afraid not, though not through lack of trying. I do have a shapeshifter in my employ, however. She's one of my top girls, in fact, though I'm certain she'd be willing to clear her schedule for you if I asked. I'll bet. Not interested, I told her. Skinwalkers give me the creeps. Besides, they never get the eyes right. Your loss, she smirked. As I said, I'm sorry I couldn't be of more help, she said, rising to her feet. I rose as well. I was obviously being dismissed. Time was credits, after all. If you hear anything, you know how to reach me, I told her, taking her hand once more. And I'd appreciate it if you'd keep this just between us. Of course, she nodded. If anything turns up, I'll let you know. I appreciate that, I said sincerely. I'll show myself out. I made my way back out to the street and headed home. Another bust. If Madame Midnight didn't know her, maybe she wasn't a Hetera. If so, there was a possibility I could get the case reopened, though I'd need some rather convincing evidence for Captain Cole to even consider it, which I didn't have. It seemed everywhere I turned I came up empty, so as I walked back to my apartment, I ran what little I did know through my mind, searching for some angle I'd missed. I could try running down one of Collarier's mining crew, but that would mean going through SynCorp, always a dicey proposition. They had a history of not playing well with others, and on the rare occasions they did cooperate, there was always a hefty price tag involved. I did have a couple of contacts in the company, but not in positions where they'd have access to personnel records. I knew a good hacker, but they kept their data locked up tighter than their credits, and if it went south, there would definitely be blowback. I was so lost in my own thoughts, it took me a good 15 minutes to realize I'd picked up a tail. He was good, whoever he was. Never got too close, stayed far enough back on the opposite side of the street that he could duck out of sight or find some innocuous way to explain his presence. How long had he been following me? Since Madame Midnight's? Or before? It didn't matter. Either way, I now had a choice before me. I could try to shake him. If he was working alone, that would be easy enough. But if he was part of a team, the odds suddenly got a lot more chancy. Or I could turn the tables. I stepped out a bit quicker, forcing him to respond in kind. Once he realized he'd been made, the choice was now his. Either stick to the tail or abort. He continued to trail behind me, still maintaining his distance, and that suited me just fine. After so many years on the job, I knew the Warren like the back of my hand. I ducked into an alleyway that led to the back door of a small restaurant. I knew they kept the door propped open to vent the heat from the kitchen, and as I sped past the cooks and busboys, I heard shouted curses in my wake. I ignored them all, focusing on what was in front of me. Shouldering my way through the door into the eating area, I hopped back outside, which now put me behind my erstwhile shadow. Let's see how he liked it. I raced back down the same stretch I'd just passed, taking the corner much wider this time as I yanked out my weapon and leapt into the alley, only to find it completely deserted. I spun on my heel, whipping back around with my sidearm at the ready, but there was no one to be found. Damn it! He must have realized what my plan was, and aborted after all. I took one last look around before I holstered my piece and started walking home once more. Who in Vishnu's name was following me, and why? There was no way this was a coincidence, and I seriously doubted it had anything to do with one of my other cases. This had to be about Lysilsa and her brother, but who had tipped him off? Madame Midnight? One of her girls? The apartment manager? Doc Takagi? My partner? The one time I let my emotions take over, and suddenly I'm a walking target. Fine then. Bring it on.